So it's interesting, I think, how the context in which we see passages of the Bible over time can shape and even define the meaning of that passage. Here's what I mean by that. 1 Corinthians 13, right? Love is patient, love is kind, has nothing to do with a marriage. Well, it's not that it doesn't have anything to do with marriage, but it's not about marriages. But isn't that the way that we know that passage? Is because almost every wedding that we've ever been to, if it's a Christian wedding, then they're quoting 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love is patient, love is kind. It's not the wrong thing to do, but we hear it so much in that context that we forget that passage wasn't about marriage. That passage is about communities. That's one example. The context in which we hear a passage over and over again shapes how we understand it. It shapes kind of what we think it even means. Here's another example. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that everyone who believes in him, right? You know the passage? That doesn't guarantee your team a victory. I know that's the context in which we see John 3:16 over and over and over again, but that doesn't guarantee you that your particular team is going to win unless you are the Texas Longhorns who won in the ninth inning last night in the College World Series. We were down 5-2 entering the ninth. There was a whole story. We came back, we won. It was great. John 3:16. But aside from that particular very specific story and instance, John 3:16 is not about our favorite sports teams. John 3:16 is about the mission of Jesus Christ. Maybe one of the most famous examples is that Psalm 23 is not exclusively about or for memorial services and funerals. It wasn't written exclusively to be read or remembered when we lose a loved one. It's not wrong in that context, but sometimes, because that seems to be, in a lot of ways, the only place that we hear Psalm 23, we tend to allow that to deeply shape how we use Psalm 23. The only time we turn to it is when we've lost a loved one. So that must be the only meaning that it has. And the truth is, I think we perhaps have lost some of the power and scope of Psalm 23 because we have relegated it to a particular context when it was written to be expansive in nature, expansive in application. So today, part of what we want to do is to reclaim Psalm 23. And we're going to reclaim that passage by turning toward a person and a particular location that will help us understand it a little bit better and expand our imagination to help us see better how God shows up in wilderness seasons. This is the second week of our series called In the Wilderness, and last week we talked about how the wilderness is a place that lacks everything necessary for survival. If you weren't here last week, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that message, but I'm going to give you a summary of what the wilderness is, and I'm going to describe a physical wilderness, but I want to invite you to consider the spiritual, emotional, relational wildernesses that come our way all too often. This is how Jeremiah describes the wilderness that we're going to be talking about today, and I think it's important to remember exactly what it was. This is Jeremiah chapter 2. I'm going to start in verse 6. This is God talking to the people, and he says, "They didn't say, 'Where is the Lord who brought us up from the land of Egypt, who led us in the wilderness, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, in a land that no one passes through and where no one lives.'" That's the wilderness. It is not North Georgia. The wilderness is a moonscape that has nothing necessary for survival. We hear that description from Jeremiah. We hear that kind of thing all through Scripture. And what we talked about last week and what we're going to spend a couple more weeks exploring is that God doesn't lead us into the wilderness just so that we can try to run out of it as quickly as we possibly can. The wilderness is uncomfortable. It's understandable that we want to get through it when we get to the other side. We understand how quickly we want to make that happen, but there is something unique about the wilderness that allows us to encounter God in a powerful way. And God even names the meaning of our wilderness seasons, not just the wilderness seasons that happen in Scripture, but the wilderness seasons that you and I experience. God names the meaning of them in Deuteronomy chapter 8. This is what we looked at last week, that God leads us into the wilderness to humble us, to test the depth of our trust in God, and to teach us about who he is and how he shows up in those kinds of seasons. So we're going to continue that series this week by looking at another passage. But for a moment, I want to step back from all of that and remind you of the story of David, right? I think many of us know at least something of David's story. Even if you didn't grow up in church, you've heard of David and Goliath. Well, before David became king, right? David eventually becomes king of all of Israel. But before he becomes king, before he receives this incredible eternal promise from God, before he becomes king, before he establishes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, before he brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, which makes it the center of the universe, before all of that happens, before David is crowned king, before David was running from his father-in-law Saul because Saul wanted to kill him dead real good, before David married Saul's daughter, before David was Saul's calm keeper, before David was the instrumentalist that brought peace into Saul's life, before David fought Goliath, before David was best friends with Saul's son Jonathan, before David was anointed to be the next king, before David was proclaimed as a man after God's own heart, before all of that, before anything happens in David's life, his story begins as the youngest son of a man named Jesse, who lived in Bethlehem, the same one, who lived in Bethlehem and was a shepherd to his father's flocks. That's where David gets his start. And Bethlehem is a fascinating place. We usually only think about Bethlehem around December 24th and 25th, but it turns out other things happen in Bethlehem too. It's a fascinating place. It was known for two things in the ancient world. The first thing was its grain production, because Bethlehem and the surrounding area, they had U-shaped valleys and broad, not plains, but hills, rolling hills that were great for growing grain in a land that didn't have a ton of acreage for that kind of thing. Bethlehem became known as the place where grain grew really well. That's why Bethlehem means house of bread. So it was really known for that reason. And it didn't have the V-shaped valleys. When you go to Jerusalem, the surrounding hill, the surrounding topography has V-shaped valleys, which means that the water just pours off of it. It carries all the topsoil away. If you want to grow anything around Jerusalem in that central hill valley, you've got to do terracing kind of work. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and a ton of time to make that land grow anything. But Bethlehem, it's easy. It's easy to grow things in Bethlehem because it was made for that kind of thing. So it was known as the house of bread. The other thing that Bethlehem was known for was it contained great pasture land for growing. You don't grow a flock of sheep, do you? Man, last service I said sheeps, and this service I said grow a flock of sheep. I'm going to get it right at some point, but lots of sheep and goat raising, there you go, around Bethlehem because the fields were able to sustain larger flocks. A lot of the sheep that were used and lambs that were used in the temple for the sacrifices in their worship, a lot of those came from the area around Bethlehem. But a couple of times a year, there came a problem because the land as an agricultural producer, right, where that land that's supposed to produce grain comes in conflict with sheep and goats that want to eat it. And so when the harvest becomes vulnerable, right, when that grain becomes vulnerable, the shepherds had to move the sheep out of the land. They couldn't be where we were trying to grow grain because they would eat all of it before it came to fruition. So the shepherds had to leave that area. And that meant that they had to go somewhere that wasn't trying to grow grain and yet had the capacity to sustain larger flocks of sheep and goats. And so oftentimes the shepherds in Bethlehem would move directly to the east. But you don't have to go far. When you go east of Bethlehem, you don't have to go far before you reach the edge of the wilderness. And that's exactly where the shepherds in Bethlehem would take their flocks. In the winter months in particular, because that's part of when that grain harvest is vulnerable. In the winter months, there was a little bit more rain. And so the edge of the wilderness was a place where grasslands sort of sprouted up. And I know we talk about the wilderness as lacking everything necessary for survival, but there's a brief time, kind of a transitional time, where the edge of that wilderness could sustain those flocks. But listen, a flock of sheep. Do you have a flock of sheep or a herd of sheep? It's a flock, right? I'm all messed up now. Listen, they got to eat 7 hours a day. Gosh, 7 hours a day. You got to find enough grass for your sheep to eat 7 hours a day. And as those winter rains receded, the green that's temporarily present on the edge of that wilderness season begins to recede with that rain. It begins to retreat into these isolated pockets that are scattered throughout the wilderness. And they both retreat and they get smaller and smaller. It's almost a micro pasture, right? 10 to 15 feet across. That's the size of pasture. That's the only size of pasture that's able to be sustainable in the wilderness area. And it would only happen in those rare places. I mean, think about how specific this is. It would have to happen in a shaded place in a wilderness that has no shade, right? So the hilltop has to be just in the right direction to cast a little bit of shade so that all the water doesn't evaporate out and kill the grass. It's such a specific region. These are such a specific instance. These micro pastures are scattered throughout. So think about how skilled and knowledgeable a shepherd would have to be to go and find a micro pasture in the midst of a vast and rugged wilderness. Right? That's what they had to do. And the same thing is true with water, by the way. When those winter rains come, water pools, some springs develop. But as the winter rains recede, those pools and springs retreat as well. And so the shepherd has to know exactly where to go to find both the food and the water. Very specific knowledge, very skilled that they would have to be to lead their flocks into that place day after day, week after week. We're not talking about doing this for a day or two. We're talking about doing this for weeks on end as that grain harvest matures. So, as you're wandering throughout the wilderness, as you're trying to find these micro pastures and these small pools of water, remember that you're also traversing incredibly tricky terrain, right? Very rocky, very challenging. So this creates a few different obstacles for you. One, you have predators hiding around each corner because they know where that flock is. And if you're a predator in the wilderness, you don't have access to a ton of food. So you start seeing 10 or 15 or 20 sheep coming towards you, you're going to get pretty excited about it. So the shepherd's going to have something to fend off those kinds of natural predators, right? Something that you can throw like a spear that you could throw at them to eliminate that threat to your sheep or to your goats, the ones that you're responsible for. And you're also going to have other shepherds who are competing for those scarce resources. So you're going to have to know something about protecting your flock. And remember that it doesn't take much for that sheep to stumble, to break a leg, for it to wander off. So you're going to have some kind of instrument as a shepherd, some kind of staff that will pull your sheep back from the edge of danger. This is the context in which David grows up. Before all of the things happen, right? Before David and Goliath, before he becomes king, before he receives this eternal covenant, before all of that, this is the context of David's childhood. This is what formed and shaped him as a young man. So when it came time to fight Goliath, it wasn't new for David. He had been fighting predators in the wilderness to protect his sheep for years. When it came time for David to flee from Saul's wrath, from his father-in-law's wrath, he had the stamina to do that because he had survived weeks and weeks and weeks on end in the wilderness. His upbringing prepared him for that moment. But that's not all. What we also see is that David learned something incredibly powerful and incredibly unique about how God shows up in the wilderness. And we know that because we have at least part of what we might call David's prayer book. This is what we sometimes call the Psalms. Not all of the Psalms were written by David himself, but a lot of them were. And Psalm 23 gives us unique insight, a unique point of view into David's learning about who God is and how God shows up in the wilderness in particular. So I want to share this with you. We don't often think about Psalm 23 as a wilderness psalm because the word wilderness doesn't show up anywhere in this psalm. But holding in your mind what it meant for a shepherd to lead a flock through the wilderness, hear these words that are probably familiar to many of us. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So remember, this is David, who has not only shepherded sheep by this point in his life, he's shepherded the nation of Israel. That David is saying, the Lord is my shepherd. There's never been a greater shepherd in Israel's history, except for Jesus, but he comes later. There's never been a greater shepherd in Israel's history than David, and yet David is the one saying, God is my shepherd. And the very next thing that he says, I shall not want. Now, if this is a wilderness song, if this is a psalm that takes place, that's driven by the image of a vast, rugged wilderness that has nothing necessary for survival, then what David just said is profound. We usually skip to the next thing, but pause for a moment and consider that David says, not only is God my shepherd, but I shall not want. In other words, I don't need anything. There's no time in which I'll be lacking something critical. I shall not want. It is a massive promise if you're in the wilderness. And that's what I think David is drawing on as he forms this prayer for us. I think David is remembering back to all those times, not just when he was a shepherd shepherding sheep, but all those times that God has carried him through battles, carried him through intrigue, carried him through family challenges. He's looking back at all of that and saying, even in those wildernesses, I'll have what I need because God is my shepherd. Listen to the next line. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Now, if this is a psalm that takes place in Bethlehem, then we would look at that and say, well, okay, I mean, it's not that hard. There's green pastures literally everywhere. But this psalm doesn't take place in Bethlehem. This psalm takes place in the wilderness where there are no green pastures. There are only micro pastures, which I'm not even sure if that's a word, 10 or 15 feet wide. That's what you're looking for in the midst of this vast ruggedness. And yet the shepherd knows how to get you to these green pastures, these small patches of sustenance and nourishment in a land that has almost none. That takes a shepherd who not only knows that you are hungry, but he knows how to fill your hunger. He knows where to go. He knows how to lead you there as well. He not only knows the need, he knows how to fill it as well. Listen to the next line. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Again, if this is in Bethlehem, there's water everywhere. It doesn't take any skill or any great power for a shepherd to lead a sheep to water in a place full of wells. But this isn't that kind of story. This is a story that unfolds in the wilderness where there is virtually no water. Again, the shepherd not only knows that you need water to survive, the shepherd knows how to get you there, where to go, and he has the power to make it happen. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. There's nothing that I'll go without. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. And we talked about those wrong paths. Easy to take a wrong path and land yourself in front of a natural predator and land yourself in conflict with another shepherd and land yourself with a broken leg or a bruised hip or whatever it is, right? Easy to take a wrong path, but the shepherd leads you not down the wrong path, but down the right path because he knows what you need. He knows where you need to go, and he knows how you need to get there. The shepherd leads you in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Think about this, that valley, that shadowed valley, where sometimes it appears as death, but it lacks the reality of death, and sometimes death is waiting around the corner. You don't really know what it is, but you don't have to be overwhelmed and overcome by fear. Why? Because you are with me. That's what David says. And he says that not because he just wants you to feel better. He says that because he's seen it time and time and time again in his life, not just as a shepherd, but as the leader, as the king of Israel. That no matter how dark it looks, he isn't alone. He doesn't travel that road by himself. So he doesn't have to be overcome and overwhelmed by fear. He says, your rod and your staff are with me. They comfort me, right? That rod is that spear, right? It's that thing that eliminates the threats, the things that threaten to take life. And that staff is that crook, right? That staff that pulls us back from the edge of danger. It protects us. God protects, the shepherd protects us from threats that come our way and the danger we unknowingly walk into. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. It feels like we've pulled out of that wilderness image. But think about it as painting an image of dissonance between the image of a feast and a party on the one hand, and the abundant food and sustenance, the abundant drink, the abundant joy, and the wilderness on the other, right? That lacks everything we need to survive. David declares that even in the presence of his enemies, even in the darkest moments, God is preparing a place of abundance for us. And that's not about a material abundance. That is about an abundance of God's presence that leads us to the good life. You prepare a table before me, even in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. This is an image of blessing, an image of abundant blessing. That anointing with oil is a sign of God's Spirit, that in the wilderness, the Spirit is poured over us. Right? The Spirit is poured over us even to the point of blessing us, even in a place like the wilderness. And he goes on to say, my cup overflows. It's not just a little bit of that blessing. It's not just a little bit of that Spirit. It's not just barely enough of God's presence to help us survive. It is an abundance of God's presence, Spirit, and provision. And then at the end of the psalm, right? At the end of the psalm, we go home. Because at the end of the shepherd's day, he doesn't just leave his sheep out in the wilderness to wander or to be attacked. The shepherd takes his sheep back to the sheep pen. Even if it's a temporary one, they go back home at night. And so that's where the psalm ends. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. It is a homecoming wilderness psalm that God will guide you through. God will provide for you on the journey, and God will bring you home. That, friends, that is Psalm 23. So powerful when we lose a loved one. Perhaps even more powerful as we apply David's lessons about the wilderness to whatever challenge you're facing today. Right? What David invites us to do is to lift our vision up. Part of the challenge of a wilderness is that it seizes control of our eyes. We can only see the vastness of the challenge that we're facing. We can only see the depth of threat that stands before us. We can only see the impossibility of traversing that terrain in our life. But David says, when you find yourself in the wilderness, lift your eyes. Because it is the shepherd that transforms the wilderness from a place that lacks everything to a place that lacks nothing. What David teaches us is if we will lift our eyes from the wilderness around us to the shepherd in front of us, then God will make a way. God will make a way. We will not only have an encounter with God in those seasons, but God will make a way to the green pasture, to the still water, to the safety of home. God will make a way. Because the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want.